Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis, LA and dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello?
Hello, can I please speak with Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor?
Yeah, that's me. I'm speaking.
Keeanga, it's a pleasure to have you on the Quarantine Tapes. Thank you so much for taking my call. I'm really delighted to be speaking with you.
Thank you, and I'm glad to be able to talk to you as well.
Thank you. In this very dire, delirious, difficult, dark times, I feel the urge really to hear your voice in particular. You recently said something I would like you to unpack. You said there are times typically in the midst of crisis when the true character of our society reveals itself and the brutality of our social hierarchy is laid bare. Can you say more about that?
Sure. I think that a lot of times in the United States in particular, the issues with racism, poverty, extreme, and in many cases extraordinary social inequality are hidden. They're hidden through our popular culture. Movies are about Hollywood and beautiful people and magazines and music and all of that. We have $1 million newscasters. The average income of or wealth of a U.S. senator is $3 million. The average wealth of a person in the House of Representatives is $990,000. So we have a society that tends to have a view from the rich and powerful, and that means that the experiences of ordinary people are subjugated, or hidden, or just ignored. And so in a moment like this, where society is upended, it means that the crises that are typically buried and on the bottom of society are brought to the surface. And in this crisis in particular, where it is driven by this highly contagious virus that can afflict anyone, then it means that the conditions of the poorest people in this country are no longer just their problem. They become a problem for everyone. And so it is particularly true when we think about the ways that low-wage workers, poor people in general, are those who have the most contact with the public, because they are working in the jobs that actually make society function. And so this is exposing the extraordinary class inequality in the United States in ways that have happened before, but often can be dismissed as a particular or regional. So we think about Hurricane Katrina in 2005. That became a narrative about racism and poverty in the South, and how what conditions led to those types of situations not being improved over time. It became a way to talk about it as a particular issue for particular people. But if Katrina was about the Gulf Coast and the persistence of racism and poverty in the South, then the coronavirus is showing that it was not a regional affliction, that those conditions are not just based in region, but that they are endemic to the United States itself. And so it's showing us things that we can't easily compartmentalize, marginalize, put in a box, and continue to ignore. We are confronted with them in a very visceral way right now.
So they've been obfuscated in some way until they are revealed by a virus such as this one. This doesn't come to you, I would imagine, at all as a surprise. This crisis, in a way, was always there, and in a sense, when people are talking already now about returning to normal, it's quite extraordinary how quickly people talk about returning to normal. Returning to normal would mean what? And why would returning to normal be even advisable?
Well, I think, any discussion about returning to normal at this point is delusional.
Right.
Our entire conception of what is normal is going to be forever distorted. The pandemic is not some weird outlier that will wrap up and just resume life as we knew it. This is, in and of itself, a consequence of issues with climate change, issues with the constant encroachment on space, in the search of, ever greater profits in building and extraction. And so this crisis is a product of the very way that business as usual has been conducted, not just in the United States by any means, but around the world. And so that's one thing. I think the other part of this is that the particular manifestation of this crisis in the United States, and the way that the U.S. is just completely ill-equipped to deal with this crisis, is also a product of what has been deemed normal in years and decades previous. It's not as if, it would be easy to just say that, Trump is a complete inept buffoon, and this is why this is happening. Clearly, there is a truth to his ineptitude, his buffoonery. Of course, there's a truth to that, and there's also a truth to the fact that his inability or unwillingness, somewhere in between those two, to deal sufficiently with this crisis for a month has certainly exacerbated things. But the underlying reasons for why the U.S. is so ill-equipped for this long precede the Trump administration. The fact that we don't have universal health care is not a product of the Trump administration, but this has been a bipartisan objective to block the provision of universal health care in the United States. The reliance on a low-wage workforce predates Trump. The absolute insufficiency of the American welfare state is a bipartisan product that has been, whatever state that we have has been chipped away for the last 45 years. That's been a bipartisan effort. And so all of the factors that might combine to mitigate the worst aspects of a crisis have been worn thin for so long that when a crisis of this nature, really a crisis of any nature, whether it was Hurricane Katrina, whether it was Hurricane Maria a few years ago, that flooded Houston, all of these, all the consequences of having no real infrastructure concerning social welfare is coming home to roost right now. And it's typical in these situations. It will have the biggest and most catastrophic consequences for poor and working class people, a disproportionate number of whom are black and brown. And so that was the normal that helped to set the stage for what we are dealing with now. So returning to that does nothing for the people who have been suffering beforehand, but whose suffering now is compounded.
in many ways, there is such a parallel with the crash of 2008. And how did the economic crisis of 2008 disproportionately affect African Americans? And if one can say so, what might be a lesson that we could learn when we return to not normal, but something different?
Well, I think 2008 was catastrophic in multiple ways. African American unemployment quintupled. It was. I think by 2011, Black unemployment peaked at around 17%. Black wealth that had been accumulated painstakingly in home ownership was eviscerated. 244,000 African American families lost their home as a result of the foreclosure crisis that ensued in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008. These are consequences that African American families have never recovered from. There's a reason why Black home ownership now is at its historic low of 40%. And coming out of this crisis, it will drop to an all-time new low. We know that at least since the 1950s, Black unemployment has always remained consistently, without question, in recession or boom. Black unemployment has been twice that of white people. So we can expect catastrophically high unemployment in African American communities. And so the so-called normal had created the conditions for Black deprivation then that exploded into social movement organizing within the Black Lives Matter movement. That was a product of the normal. And so we can expect that even in this crisis, all of these crises produce a social response, because the inaction or the failure, the sclerotic pace at which the federal government acts to mitigate the crisis is so insufficient that it always provokes a social response. So I think that there's no question that will happen. Right. Whether it is successful, I think, depends upon what lessons we learn from the last successive waves of struggle. And this, I think, the nature of this crisis, which is one that is much more deeply rooted and even more profound, I would say, than 2008, because it is showing the absolute inability of the American state to respond adequately to this, will raise bigger questions about the nature of our society in general. And I think the entire discussion about universal health care and Medicare for all will take on greater urgency, because you can no longer, with any real credibility, say that it is the best system in the world to have people's health care tied to their employment when tens of millions of people are losing their jobs. That
losing their jobs, but also unable, I mean, quite apart from the health insurance, we've just gone past April 1st, and so many Americans cannot pay, unable to pay their rent. So the housing issue,
they can't pay their rent. Yes,
the housing issue, which you, Keeanga, have studied, I mean, for the better part, I think, of your life, has come now with this pandemic and with this crisis and with this virus to the forefront. You once wrote that housing, more than any area, shows the abject failure of capitalism to solve the problems of African Americans. And I think this crisis now makes your words, one might say, unfortunately, even more pungent and poignant.
Well, I think that as a species, we decided long ago that shelter, along with food and water, was critical for us to perpetuate ourselves into the future. And given that criticality, the idea that it has a price on it, that it is for money that allows you to have safe, sound, comfortable housing is all, to me, is all that you need to know about the inhumanity of capitalism. And that, again, is on vicious display for people, landlords that are hounding people who are under mandate to stay inside, to stay home, businesses that have been closed by mandate, thus people being out of work. You have landlords and their bill collectors calling on them to hound people for rent. It is the most basic expression of the inhumanity of capitalism. And so I think that all of these things, these kinds of inequalities that are typically hidden, that people sort of have accepted almost as just the wallpaper in our society, that it is so accepted that you don't even recognize the inequality around us, has come into sharp focus. And this is what our movement will be grappling with, not the smaller questions that can seem very large in their context, but in the midst of this crisis, the small questions will seem small, and the existential questions will rise to the surface, and those are the ones that we have to be prepared to grapple with.
I want you to talk more about that those two words you uttered, our movement, what you're referring to at this moment, because as a lifelong activist, I really wonder how you recommend that people resist at this moment when at the same time there is such a need, an understandable need for social distancing. How can people in a way come together when they can't be together?
Come together, yes. So that
I have a feeling that this is at the core of what we must discuss. Is, you know, we're all. I'm walking around the streets of Los Angeles, where not so many people always walk around the streets, but now when they walk around the streets, they are far apart from each other. Everybody's turning their face the other way. I mean, sociologically, this moment is just extraordinary.
So I think that when I talk about movement in this moment, it's aspirational, and the aspiration is based in history, not religiosity, but the idea and the understanding that social crises produce a social response. I think that the contours of our response have yet to be determined, but I will say that history is replete with examples of the creativity of ordinary people in response to the constraints on their ability to protest social inequality and oppression. And so we can think about any number of examples. In the United States, we can think about the impossibility of ending slavery. We can think about the impossibility of women getting the right to vote, the impossibility of ending Jim Crow segregation, the impossibility of securing African Americans' right to vote. All of these things were believed to be impossible to accomplish because of the legal constraints on demonstrating, which was a kind of social distancing imposed on people within a different context, that people had to figure out new and different ways of challenging. And so I think that we're in a similar situation where it is the creativity of people who are being subjected to the harshest results of this crisis that will have to figure out a way to overcome the immediate constraint of social distancing. So that's one thing. I think the other part is that we can see the constitutive elements of what a resistance to this could possibly look like. We can see it in the actions in workplaces across the country, where workers have resisted their employers' efforts to skimp on materials needed to protect themselves, whether it's hand sanitizer, hot water, soap. People have erupted in protest against this. And this isn't just about their protest for their own sake, but in doing so, they have raised public awareness about the conditions in the workplace, which now, because of the nature of this virus, those workplace conditions are important to everyday people who are calling on places like Amazon,
Right.
And beyond for goods. And so that is part of what has created the pressure on these employers to relent and to provide better sanitation for the workers. So that's one thing I think that can be built upon. The other is an example that I think is also important, which is one of workers at General Electric who unionized workers who staged a in-person protest where they stood 6 feet apart from each other in silent protest, and then they proceeded to march 6 feet between each of them to demand that instead of GE instituting layoffs, that they should repurpose the assignments of their workforce to build the desperately needed ventilators for hospitals across the country. And so that's an example also of solidarity.
Yeah, it is. And you know, another company that I'm not sure you're aware has been doing this. It surprised me tremendously. Is Brooks Brothers. Of all companies, Brooks Brothers.
Oh, with the mask.
Yeah. I mean, which struck me as, you know, the most preppy of all brands.
Yes.
You know, I mean, realizing that, yes, there's a need to do something now, rather than laying off all the, as you said, laying off all the workers of Brooks Brothers. Let's do something with our expertise, which is making clothes,
right.
Maybe not for lawyers to go to work, nothing wrong with that, but
right.
to help this moment. And what's also important to me is that in this moment of social distancing, we're relying on the very tools that so often control us, namely all the social platforms. And I'm wondering if there are concerns you might have there, both in terms of how these platforms control us, but also in terms of how we might use them in a beneficial way.
Well, there's an enormous concern, and I think that, you know, we've seen in Kashmir most recently the way that the state can just pull the plug on social media platforms, on the internet itself, and grossly limit our ability to be in touch with each other. And so I think that we desperately need to develop our own platforms to be in contact with each other, whether that is on the telephone, whether it is through some form of print media. I don't know, but I think that this is a live question that, you know, people who are concerned about organizing have to take up. And I think in the meantime, that we have to pressure to whatever extent that we can the federal government, these institutions, these organizations themselves, to demand greater privacy, to demand greater democratic input and oversight. And, you know, these are issues that I think are also tied into the the challenges that any movement, any organizing will have to take up, because it is a huge problem that for many of us, these privately owned, profit-making enterprises are the predominant way in which we communicate with each other. It's a huge problem.
And it's interesting to me, though we don't have much time to talk about it now, how, for instance, the telephone, which we're using now, you and I, which up to 2 months ago seemed tremendously exotic, has become one of our main modes of communication. Issues of privacy are so important. I wish I had time to talk to you about prisons, and also time to talk to you about some of the extraordinary comments that Ibram Kendi has made about this pandemic being a pandemic within a pandemic. But the way in which I would like to end is by quoting back to you the extraordinary epigraph you have to your book Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation by Frederick Douglass, and have you comment on it. It's a quotation from 1957 where he says, "Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress."
Frederick Douglass.
Oh, God.
I mean, I think that the essence of that is no one is coming to save us. We have to save ourselves. And that is not a wish in the dark. That is based in history and politics and struggle. And that is, to me, that is the essence of not just Frederick Douglass's comment, but his political commitment for the, most of his extraordinary life, is that without struggle, there is no progress. And we have reached the precipice of that. And, that's the task at hand, because once we get to the other side of this particular pandemic, and no one should think that this is a one-off event by any means.
Yeah.
No, this is part of the climate crisis, right? So, but once we get on the side of this particular episode, we really have to rethink the structure, the organization of our society, and what kind of organizing and struggle it will take to forever change it. Because this crisis, again, is exposing a brutal class hierarchy that is at the heart of American society. And it's going to cost thousands of people their lives, and in such a way that we will know that the only reason many of them died is because they were poor, black, and brown. Those are not the only people who are suffering through this crisis right now, but they will suffer the most. And so we have to change the dynamics of a society that allows for that to happen, that allows for it to drift into the background, and that allows us to become so habituated to it that we don't see it happening except in moments of crisis. It has to be rejected all the time.
Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, what a pleasure to talk with you, even if the news is both terrible, but maybe there are shards of hope somewhere. I hope so. It's really been excellent to talk to you. I should tell our listeners that Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And let's hope that...
Thank you so much, Paul.
Let's hope that the struggle yields positive results. All the best to you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, Go to dublab.com/support.